discuss the first draft of the Adaptation Planning Guide, otherwise known as the APG 2.0. We're excited to co-host this webinar with our partners from the American Planning Association, California chapter. And my name is Derek Lambeth, and I'm an Emergency Services Coordinator here with the Cal OES and a member of this project team. Now allow me to introduce some of the other members. We have Miles Gordon, whose services are loaned out to us through the Civic Spark Fellow Program. And also now introducing the consultant team, there's Tammy Seal, who is the project lead with PlaceWorks, and Eli Crispy, also a member of the PlaceWorks team, PlaceWorks Inc., excuse me. And you just heard the voice of Natalie Hernandez, who is a member of Climate Resolve and also a member of this project team. And now, what is the APG? So the Adaptation Planning Guide helps local, regional, and tribal governments in addressing the unavoidable consequences of climate change by providing the latest adaptation resources and planning methodologies. The first guide was created in 2012 as a set of 4 complementary documents. Since 2012, there have been substantial developments in the climate adaptation space, resulting in more conclusive science, innovative adaptation practices and projects, and progressive climate legislation. Notably, this update of the APG, or APG 2.0, provides an easy-to-follow 4-phase process for governments to develop their own adaptation and resilience strategies. The APG 2.0 incorporates findings from the Safeguarding California Plan 2018 update, California's 4th Climate Change Assessment, and other state climate documents. It also provides detailed information and steps on how to complete a vulnerability assessment and adaptation framework. And we just want to stress, and you'll hear us stress this throughout the webinar here, that this is a resource. It is not a mandate from the state telling you how you must do something. It's just a suggestion and a reference for those that are looking to develop their own adaptation strategies. Now on to the Interagency Working Group. A diverse interagency working group of 35 representatives helped advise on the content of the APG 2.0. It was critical to have their expertise in reviewing the topics and pointing the consultant team towards resources. And for this public review period of the APG 2.0, which will begin very shortly, we decided to co-host 3 webinars with organizations whose audience will be users of the information. We're aiming to reach as many stakeholders as possible and could not do it without the help of our partners. I would like to introduce Julia Lave Johnston, the president at the American Planning Association's California chapter, which should be noted is the largest chapter in the nation, to go ahead and say a few introductory words. Take it away, Julia.
Thank you so much. So I want to thank OES for inviting APA California to be involved in this process and to provide feedback. And I want to thank you all for taking the time to participate in what I think we all can agree is a really important issue, adaptation planning, and helping our communities become more resilient and address some of the large issues that are facing them as we move towards the future. I don't think I need to spend a lot of time trying to convince you how important adaptation planning is, how we have some large challenges facing us, how we need to collectively work together to find solutions. I think we agree on that. I know that APA California has been, our members have been working on this issue for a while now, and we really appreciate the state providing guidance. I think that the state plays a really crucial role in putting together a framework that creates a common language that we can speak and share best practices in. So I really do appreciate OES taking the lead on this and inviting us to lend our expertise and our experience. The policies are really important, but we all know that policies are only as effective as implementation, and I think that's where planners across the state and other professionals involved in adaptation, resiliency, and climate change can really help inform these policies. So thank you again for sharing your expertise and your experience. I think that collectively we can work together to create great communities for all. And I know that this is just the first and one of many conversations that we'll be having in the months and years to come as we address um, these new challenges that face us that are being brought on by climate change and some of the other large environmental issues that we have that are facing California and the communities that we work in. So thank you all again, and thank you, OES. And I'd like to turn it over now to Tammy Seal from PlaceWorks.
Thank you, Julia. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be able to share with you our public review draft of the APG 2.0. So I'm going to take a couple minutes here just to talk about the planning process we've followed for updating the adaptation planning guide. And then I'll be turning it over to Eli Crispy and Natalie Hernandez of our project team, who will both go over a few more details of the content of the APG before we then open it up to your questions. So I'd like to first start just with an introduction of our larger consultant team. And, Derek introduced those of us who are able to join the webinar today. We have a great project team here with representatives from PlaceWorks. We're the prime consultant, and we're working in collaboration with ICF, Climate Resolve, and Doctors Adrian Grieve and Michael Boswell of Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. Dr. Grieve and Dr. Boswell were involved in preparation and led the preparation of the first APG, APG 1.0. So it's been really important to have them involved, not only to add their knowledge, expertise in best practices and research, but also to pull forward some of the history of the APG. And this team represents a committed team of planners, engineers, outreach specialists, folks very committed and involved with community engagement, staff and faculty who are teaching climate action planning to our next generations of planners and engineers. And everyone on the team has applied experience in climate action planning and mitigation and in adaptation, and has worked extensively throughout California. So we were really excited to be able to come together and work with Cal OES on the project. So we can go to the next slide. So our goals for APG 2.0 when we started was to first focus on refreshing the content, to update and integrate new state resources to be reflective of any new state laws or regulations or requirements, to integrate updated science, and to then go out and gather, collect, and incorporate best practices from local governments and tribal communities. We wanted the APG to be able to provide the resources on alignment and integration with, all the other local, regional, and state adaptation planning efforts. Recognizing that there have been some new state requirements since their first adaptation planning guide, we wanted to be able to present the information in a manner that supported those who wanted to be able to use parts of it as part of their compliance or consistency with SB 379. And early on, to be responsive to stakeholder engagement that we heard, we wanted to ensure that this adaptation planning guide was integrated, notably that it integrated equity and outreach into all content. And as we've been preparing the adaptation planning guide, we've also been anticipating that it would be fully integrated into the adaptation clearinghouse. So as you'll see, one change with this version of the APG is that we have a single PDF that will soon be available for everyone to view from the Cal OES website. And then next year, we'll have it integrated as an online document for users as well. Just want to do a quick check here. Natalie, can you still hear me?
Yes, Tammy, I can still hear you.
Okay, sorry, I just got an alert on my screen that I had been disconnected. So I just wanted to check before I kept going. Sorry, everyone. Okay, and as part of our, we can go to the next slide, because we wanted to be thorough and deliberative in our process, as part of our planning, we conducted an extensive literature review and a plan review as we got started to help shape our recommendations and ultimately our outline and the content for the APG. In the literature review, our team reviewed peer-reviewed research and publications. We were specifically looking for any updated guidance or findings related to what we knew would be content of the APG, specifically vulnerability assessment processes and preparation, adaptation strategy, any assessments of effective strategy development processes or strategies and implementation. We were also reviewing for research related or findings related to equity, outreach, and engagement and adaptation. And we were also very focused on plan alignment, integration, and mainstreaming, and always being mindful of how uncertainty is being addressed as well. Next slide. So then we also, we coupled this with a thorough plan review of state plans and resources because so many new resources have become available since the first adaptation planning guide. We conducted a review of California-specific documents. We also extended our review to guidance outside of California in other states and from the federal government, and also community-based organizations. And we also reviewed guidance documents from other countries, just to ensure that we were casting a wide net and incorporating the most current best practices. We also were looking to update any definitions that we would be using in the APG and to refine any process recommendations that we would have. So for consistency with the state resources, we do have some key recommendations that are in alignment. So we'll be following the same 11 sectors that are used, for example, in the safeguarding or on the adaptation clearinghouse. We've looked to ensure consistency in all terms and definitions that we're using in the APG. And because we want to make sure that everything is integrated and consistent across all adaptation planning processes. So we coupled this review with stakeholder outreach. You can go ahead now. So we have been conducting outreach for the past year. Cal OES started us off with a survey last fall. We had some really great responses from that informed our early identification of process goals. We've been having presentations as the opportunities have become available throughout the year. We hosted listening sessions this summer to have some focused discussions on certain topics. And we also had stakeholder interviews in late spring and early summer focused on talking with local agency staff who used APG 1.0 in their adaptation plan preparations and getting a sense of how that worked for them and where they might be looking for new resources and suggestions when they embark on updates to their plans. So next slide. So what you'll see now in the new APG 2.0 is one change we've made is to transition from what we presented previously as I think it was a 9-step adaptation planning process to what we've repackaged into 4 phases. And we think these are the key primary 4 phases of an adaptation planning process. But by no means is this meant to be prescriptive. It's it's a compilation of best practice. Each phase includes steps, and in some cases, sub-steps that support getting through a complete process. But it's meant to be flexible, where communities and users should be able to plug in and move through it based on the resources they have available and the ultimate goals of their process. It can be applied to a comprehensive planning process, like a general plan update. If you're looking to update a safety element, this adaptation planning process can integrate with that. If you're updating a local hazard mitigation plan, we've identified how this process can integrate with that. Or if you're focused on a single adaptation project, we think that this planning process could work for that as well. And you'll note that outreach and engagement is integrated into each phase. So now I'd like to turn it over to Eli and Natalie so that they can share a bit more about each phase.
Thank you, Tammy. This is Eli Crispy from PlaceWorks, another member of the project team. I'll be walking through the phases of the APG 2.0 and talking a little about what is in each phase and what has changed since the earlier version of the APG. Now, this first phase is a scoping phase. It's what we're calling explore, define, and initiate. This is an entirely new phase in the APG, and it's one that we thought would be helpful in making sure that planners were fully prepared for an adaptation planning effort before starting off on it, and making sure that they knew what types of efforts were involved. There are 4 steps in this initial phase. The first step, which is motivation and scope, is really all about confirming why communities are undertaking adaptation planning efforts, what they hope to get out of it, and what are the broad parameters of that effort. The second step is what we're calling teams and resources. This is all about ensuring that the right people are involved in the planning process and that all of the participants have the resources that they need. The third step is choosing the climate effects and the populations and assets that will be analyzed through the planning process. And this helps to set up the technical analyses that we'll talk about in a few moments. Outreach and engagement is also a critical component of this phase, and it should be an ongoing effort throughout. The first phase is all about making sure that the community's adaptation planning efforts have a very clear foundation, very clear goals, there is a well-defined work group, and that all other aspects of the framework are really well-defined and understood before the in-depth work begins. We found that a scoping phase such as this really helps to ensure that the effort is comprehensive and holistic from the very beginning, and that the process is conducted efficiently and on time. So these are some of the key questions that we really hope phase 1 will help communities to answer. We want to make sure that planners and other participants in the process are thinking about some of the big vision-related aspects of adaptation planning, but that they're also thinking about some of the more focused logistics, the budget, who should be involved, and that type of information. The second phase is the vulnerability assessment itself. For those of you who have used or have reviewed the first APG, you may remember this was a 4-phase process in that document. Here we have condensed it down into 1. But that said, there are still several sub-steps to this phase. There are several important stages that need to happen for a vulnerability assessment to be completed. Communities need to confirm the climate-related effects that are of concern to them and assess how those effects may change over time, building off of the sub-steps we had in the first phase. Communities should confirm the populations and assets, which is effectively everything else in the community that isn't people, how those may be vulnerable to climate change, and assess how these population groups and other resources may be impacted. The third sub-step is to address adaptive capacity. We've heard that this is something that has been a challenge for some communities. How do you effectively analyze adaptive capacity, which is the ability to resist or recover from the effects of climate change? So we really wanted to give it its own sub-step in APG 2.0, make it as clear and as straightforward as possible. Then the fourth sub-step is all about scoring, bringing together all of the information that's been collected through the analyses and seeing where the issues of greatest vulnerability are. As with the first phase, community engagement and outreach runs throughout the entire process of phase 2. And there are some guidance and recommendations and resources in this document about how to best inform the community in this technical process. So the vulnerability assessment, for those of you who have done it, you know it is the major technical analysis that really supports the overall adaptation planning effort. So we did want to make sure that it is as straightforward and as accessible as possible. We really want this to be a technical analysis and a process that anyone can follow and conduct effectively. That said, we also wanted to make sure we were presenting sufficient detail so that we weren't oversimplifying the resources for how to do this process, or that critical aspects of the process weren't being lost. A key priority here, as Tammy mentioned a little earlier, was also to make sure that the vulnerability assessment being prepared based on the resources in the APG 2.0 are sufficient to meet the requirements for a vulnerability assessment that SD 379 now requires communities to include in their safety element. So that integration was very critical to us. The vulnerability assessment is really all about understanding how climate conditions, both in and around the community, may change, what impacts those changes may have on the community and the surrounding area, and what is the community's ability to resist and recover from those impacts, the adaptive capacity component. So by conducting this assessment and by answering some of these questions that we've laid out here, what we're really hoping is that communities can better understand how they are most susceptible to climate change. And once they know that, if you know your vulnerability, that leads to building resilience, which is really the whole point of this adaptation planning guide. The third phase in APG 2.0 is what we're calling defining the adaptation framework and strategies. And this phase focuses on taking the results of the vulnerability assessment and really translating them into policy. So we've broken this phase into 5 substeps. The first is building off of the vulnerability assessment. Summarize the vulnerability that you've produced as part of your technical assessment and really identify what are the priority issues in your community. The second substep in the APG is about confirming the goals and the visions that were identified during that first phase, in light of your vulnerability assessment and knowing what those priority vulnerabilities are. You want to make sure that they're still appropriate for the community. The third substep is to draft the strategies themselves. Use the APG, use your own policy development experience, use any other guidance or resources documents you have to prepare effective policy. And once you have those draft adaptation strategies, that's then a good time to go back to the community and conduct engagement activities. Engage with community stakeholders, help refine the strategies, and make sure that they're appropriate. We also have added a substep on measure prioritization. We recognize that communities may have quite a few adaptation issues that they want to respond to. They may not be able to put all of the policies that respond to all of these issues in place all at once. So being able to prioritize those strategies really helps to support effective implementation. And the focus of this phase is that communities come away with a set of adaptation strategies that are really focused and responsive to their vulnerabilities, and that they are appropriate given all other factors in the community characteristics and values and available resources and the like. We know that policy development can be challenging, and especially for practitioners who are trying to develop adaptation policy but may not be as familiar with the field. So the APG 2.0 does include a pretty extensive set of example strategies that are responsive to some of the key vulnerabilities that we're aware of that show up statewide. And our hope is that communities will be able to use these example strategies and mold and adapt them and make them really specific to meet their own local needs. So some of the core questions that we wanted to address in this phase are about how to prepare the adaptation strategies and then how to effectively prioritize them. We wanted to make sure that communities also had the means to address some of the big challenges that are associated with adaptation planning in their strategies. So we want to have support for strategies that help to address uncertainty around future climate conditions, or ensuring that this resilience strategy is equitable, for example. The resources and the example strategies that are in APG 2.0 for these specific topics, they're organized into sectors. As Tammy mentioned, we're following the same framework as the State Adaptation Clearinghouse, which is laid out here in the slides. That said, communities are free to organize their strategies in whatever approach works best. This is just one example that can be followed. You'll notice that there are not separate strategies or separate topics for issues such as equity or environmental justice. And this is not because they aren't important or were left out, but it's because these topics are really overarching issues that cut across numerous sectors. So they are integrated into these sectors across the board rather than being siloed into their own category. The last phase in APG 2.0 looks at what happens after the plan is developed and adopted. And we know to develop a plan and produce it and adopt it is one phase, but once you do that, it can't just sit on a shelf. It has to actually be put into effect. And that's what this phase is all about. It's translating resilience from your plan on paper into real life. It's making sure that the plan is actually addressing the resilience needs of the community, and then it's making sure that communities have the ability to respond if the plan is not working as expected. So there are 4 substeps in this phase. The first is the actual implementation effort. It's putting the strategies into effect, but of course it doesn't stop there. Monitoring is the second substep, and that's about collecting the information about how the implementation process has been going, and ideally you want to report that information publicly so the entire community is aware. And with monitoring comes evaluation, and that's all about reviewing the data, making sure that the adaptation efforts are building and supporting resilience as planned, or in some cases it may be identifying that they aren't working, they aren't being as effective as had hoped. So the fourth substep is the adjustment phase. It's going back and revising the adaptation efforts as needed to really get the results that the community wants and needs. You may remember, if you've seen the first APG, we had all the cycles of the adaptation planning effort. It was a circle, the final stage circled back and bled into the first phase. And even though here we've laid it out a little more linearly, this final step, the adjustment step, that can be the trigger that encourages communities to go back and after several years, begin the adaptation process again to make sure that everything stays up to date. As you might expect, the hope of this phase is that communities will put their adaptation strategies into effect and that communities have the tools and the resources that are needed to really measure progress and ensure that their strategies remain effective going forward. We want to help give communities the means to build both short-term and long-term resilience. So we've really developed this phase with a broad range of times in mind. Next slide, please. These are some of the key questions that we want to help communities to answer with this phase of the APG. Again, understanding that implementation itself is very important, but that it doesn't stop there. We want communities to come away with a better understanding of how to monitor, evaluate, and adjust their plans, since those are critical to a successful resilient effort. And with that, I will turn it over to Natalie Hernandez to discuss some of the other key issues that are in APG 2.0.
Thank you, Eli. My name is Natalie Hernandez. I'm the Climate Planning and Resilience Manager at Climate Resolve and part of the APG 2.0 team. So I'm presenting on the equity, outreach, and engagement sections in APG 2.0. All of the robust and extensive resources we pulled from are cited in the document, and during this webinar, I'm going to give a summary of the highlights. Integrating equity into the climate adaptation planning process is critical. Moreover, many local governments lack guidance on this, and this is what we heard through the Interagency Working Group and through the APG 2.0 listening sessions over the summer. For the purposes of climate adaptation planning, equity means first identifying persons and frontline communities who may be most vulnerable to climate change impacts like wildfires, sea level rise, heat, and precipitation changes. Second, it means ensuring that in the planning process and distribution of resources and the efforts to address systemic wrongs are all conducted in an equitable manner. So in the APG 2.0, we have a table that's taken from Ramey and Associates and the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, the Guide to Equitable Community-Driven Climate Preparedness, which parses out the different dimensions of equity to incorporate, and those are called procedural, distributional, and structural. In APG 2.0, outreach and engagement is a part of every phase. It's usually at the end of each section. A few suggested approaches are listed here. For example, in adaptation planning, it's important to train local government officials on equity, especially when those officials are being asked to work with underserved communities and in neighborhoods that have suffered historical racism. These equity issues come up with the topic of climate change and are intersectional. Other suggested outreach and engagement approaches throughout the process include identifying key stakeholders and asking those stakeholders to be a part of interviews, focus groups, or an advisory committee. Other suggested approaches include establishing community partners and valuing their time and expertise by providing stipends and meeting them where they're at. And lastly, using creative approaches like art and youth-based projects. Here are a few more suggested approaches from APG 2.0. Recognizing existing structures and networks can be an empowering process of adaptation planning, like the use of storytelling timelines and participatory asset mapping for vulnerability assessments. Then involving the community even more through the development of adaptation strategies is what makes the planning process worth the effort. I think in the end, the community and local government should feel a co-ownership of the plan and be ready to co-manage the implementation. Lastly, providing transparency and accountability throughout keeps everyone on the same page and helps show tangible results. Again, these are just a few of the suggested approaches in APG 2.0 that I'm highlighting, and there are more extensive resources in the actual document itself. I'm going to turn it over to Derek to talk about the public review.
Thank you, Natalie. Sure. Before we get to the question and answer portion, I'd like to spend a couple of minutes letting you all know how you can provide us feedback on the APG 2.0. First and foremost, the public review period should begin this week. We urge you to continue to check back to Cal OES's website, where you will find a link to the first draft, as well as a survey, which we will use to capture everyone's thoughts and comments on the project. We were able to provide a high-level overview of APG 2.0 through this webinar presentation, but please review the whole document at Cal OES's website listed here. So check back. It's not there just yet, but it'll be there soon. And as we'll be in the middle of a 30-day public comment period, and we will take comments through early January 2020. Again, please take the 5-question survey linked as you see there, and that's the best way for us to be able to keep track of the comments that we receive. And here in this next slide, you will see the plan for the remaining piece of this project. The public review draft should run through early January. We're going to have a couple of meetings that have already taken place. One, we spoke at the ICARP TAC presentation, and then these webinars. And hopefully through January through April is when we will take all of your comments into account and revise the APG accordingly with a expectation of it to be released in April 2020. And just a note, as you may have heard earlier, this also will ultimately live on Adaptation Clearinghouse website, as we hope to make this more of an interactive experience and also allow for more ease of updating the APG as we go further. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Natalie.
Thank you, Derek. This is the time of the webinar where we're inviting the audience to ask us questions. And I think the best way to do this is to type in your questions into the chat box. It allows the rest of the audience to see it if they are logged in on a computer. And then I will be reading the questions. So I invite you all to, in the chat box, type any questions that you might have, and then I will read them aloud. One thing that we're posing to the audience as a question to you all is if this adaptation planning resource or the process that we just went through kind of reflects what you're doing already in the field, because we want to make sure that we're capturing everything that is happening on the ground. So just something to think about. Okay, the first question is from Lauren Suge. During the equity section, can you clarify if this version of the guide considers equity first or last during the planning phase? It's a great question. And Tammy, I'll take a first response to this, and I think you can jump in. But we have really tried to integrate equity into all of the guide. And so you'll see that in each section of the phase, and when we're talking about particularly outreach as well, we're referencing different resources on equity. And a lot of the resources that we actually reference is the Urban Sustainability Directors Network's guide on equity, and then the Regional Resilience Toolkit from EPA. So I think if you go through the guide, you'll see that equity is not just in the first or last part of the planning phase, but all throughout the different phases that we're proposing. Tammy, do you want to add anything?
Oh,
go ahead,
yeah,
Tammy. Tammy, you should be unmuted now.
Okay. Yeah, I think you covered that well, Natalie. Our approach is the integrated approach, and we've provided some recommendations on bringing equity and engagement forward and having that at the beginning of the process and then integrated.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll say, Lauren, if there is anything you think as someone working in the field alongside us that we're missing, please provide feedback on that and we can consider incorporating it. Okay, the next question is from Adam from the city of Banning. What, if any, feedback have you received from the business community, chambers of commerce, NAOIP, VIA, etc.?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. So one important clarification we made at the beginning of the planning process and the preparation of the APG was to identify the target audience for the APG, the primary users, and then ultimately in doing that, we of course ended up with identifying secondary users or complementary users. So our primary audience for the APG is local government, and specifically local government staff who are going to be doing adaptation planning. That's local governments and tribal governments are who we expect to use the APG the most. It doesn't limit who can use it by any means. So it's prepared with the issues of local government staff in mind and the local government planning processes. So we do recognize that the business community is an important stakeholder in the adaptation planning process, and we note that, I believe, in our guidance for identifying stakeholders and engagement approaches for the private sector, especially in the vulnerability assessment. So that's really where we're focusing on the role of the business community is how the local government adaptation planning process can involve business community as a stakeholder, and then also recognizing that that involvement isn't just in the planning process, but in the implementation process as well. But as far as comments from the specific organizations you've identified, we do not have any feedback from those organizations so far.
Thank you, Tammy. The next question is from Aaron Engstrom. Surprised that adaptation pathways are only briefly mentioned, yet they seem like a final deliverable to any adaptation planning exercise. Can you provide more about the adaptation pathway planning on a neighborhood or community scale?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I can tell you, Aaron, that our team has spent a lot of time, hours, going through this and talking about what to include and how far to go on the adaptation pathways process. And we do recognize the value that it has and its importance, specifically in infrastructure and transportation projects. So far, we haven't really seen it applied to a neighborhood or community scale. And if you have a good example of that, we would love to take a look at it. We've seen it very specifically applied, but we weren't confident that we had good best practices of it in play and for the community scale planning that this APG follows. So we do recognize that there are local governments who are more advanced in their adaptation planning processes, who have had adaptation plans for quite a few years and who are now going through an implementation process that does require them to update their scenarios and to look at the effectiveness of their implementation and to see where they need to make changes or how they might program changes going forward in uncertainty. So the approach we've applied is a process that we think will work for most communities. We recognize some communities might need more advanced strategies, so we've provided that overview of the adaptation pathways approach. We are open to feedback and best practices and examples of where stakeholders think we could go further.
Thanks, Tammy. The next question is from Aaron Mann. Regarding a local jurisdiction's ability to allocate funding to adaptation planning, do you have a list of funding sources available to assist local jurisdictions in these efforts? Affordable housing planning efforts often provide assistance in identifying and applying for funds.
So thanks, Aaron. We do have in the implementation section, we do have mention of funding and financing. We do talk about it generally, so talking about types and categories of funding and financing. And this is one of the places, like you'll see in other parts of the document, where we do believe there are other documents or resources that do a good job of going into more detail. So we've provided a summary of the documents and resources that are available and links to them as well. We also recognize that funding sources change, especially grants. So we were hesitant to provide a list of existing grant resources, but as far as other funding and financing mechanisms, we have pointed to good resources for those.
The next question is from Irish Chi from LA County Planning. Does the guide have guidance on how to collect qualitative information and data on a community's adaptive capacity, such as perception or willingness to adapt?
Oh, Iris, that's a great question, and I'm gonna. I know it's one we've talked about, so I'm gonna turn this over to Eli for a first pass at that answer.
Thank you, Iris, for that. Yes, the answer to your question is there is guidance in APG 2.0 about how to get the information that is helpful for identifying adaptive capacity. So we have a set of potential plans and ordinances and other resources that are helpful to review when assessing adaptive capacity. There are also a set of potential recommended example questions that we think are helpful in interviewing people who may know about adaptive capacity, and questions that help draw out what some of these responses may be, including perception or willingness to adapt. That is certainly part of that example. So we have tried to provide a little more detail and really help communities get at adaptive capacity, which you recognize can be a kind of amorphous and difficult to assess concept.
Thanks, Eli. The next question is from Martha Nungesser. Where can I get a list of the references used in APG, state, other states, or international?
All references we used, Martha, are in the APG. So all of our sources are cited, and we have two parts of sources. So the main document, the endnotes are provided for that, and then all of the sources used for the appendix are also cited.
The next question is, Martha.
No, go ahead. I was going to say, in most cases, in those footnotes, in the endnotes, we have links to the source documents as well to make it a little easier to find them.
Okay, the next question is from Cecily Condone with Permits Sonoma. Does this address broad strategies for transfer of development rights or other ways to avoid or minimize the fiscal impacts to individual property owners in the scope of planned retreat?
A good question. Planned retreat is certainly a topic that has come up throughout our webinars. Eli, do you want to share a little bit more about the example strategies in the appendix?
Certainly. So we have, as we touched on a little earlier, for each of those 11 sectors, 11 topic areas, we have a set of approximately 5 example adaptation strategies that we think provide some broad level resilience, and then we're hoping communities will be able to take these examples and tweak them and refine them and really make them their own. In each of those strategies, we have an entry for the strategy itself, some discussion of what the strategy is and sort of why it's effective, a set of factors to consider for when implementing that strategy, areas where there may be overlap or co-benefits with other areas, who's responsible, potential funding sources, and also examples. So to your specific question regarding transfer of development rights, I believe one of the example strategies that we mention in the plan, or in the APG, is to use transfer of development rights when there are issues of retreat or some of these other concerns where land is really no longer viable for a lot of land uses. We do talk broadly about how TDR strategies can be effective and what some of the factors to consider are when looking at a TDR program. And we've tried not to get too specific in those recommendations or factors to consider, because they really do need to be things that are locally tailored and very specific to the needs of individual communities. But we hope that there is some broad information there that would be enough to get started and start thinking about how might something like a transfer of development rights strategy work for community X.
Thank you, Eli. I just wrote into the chat box if there are additional questions that others would like to ask. So feel free to type those in.
Hey Natalie, this is Miles. Just while we're waiting for additional questions, I wanted to give a real quick plug. So for anyone who might be looking for examples of on-the-ground implementation of APG guidance, a large part of my job with the APG project team has been to actually work with a couple different counties to test drive this new APG, and going into 2020, I will actually be putting together detailed case studies of how these two counties have been implementing climate resilience planning measures per APG guidance on the ground, and so that information it will definitely be forthcoming in the new year.
Thanks, Miles. I appreciate you bringing that up. That has been a question of how is APG 2.0 integrating case studies? That's come up in another webinar and then during an in-person presentation. So it is good to know that that will be forthcoming. And then there are some at least like call-out boxes with a lot of the efforts that are already going on the ground in APG 2.0. But like Miles said, I think these case studies will be showing how APG 2.0 is helping folks implement it with the current guidance that's out there.
I see a question in the chat box asking which counties, I'm working at specific counties are Butte County and Mahoney, and then Tulare County in the Central Valley.
Thanks, Miles. The next question is about, will there be any templates with graphics for the different phases to be used in outreach, plan sections, and bulletins? Also an awesome question. That is something that we're able to find in some other documents like the Regional Resilience Toolkit. So what we did in APG 2.0, rather than like create our own templates, is we took a snapshot and then we reference people to the Regional Resilience Toolkit that EPA, Office of Planning and Research, and I know the ABAG collaborated on. And so there are references to those templates. And you can find those, I think, in a lot of the outreach sections. Tammy, do you want to add anything to that?
I think that's where we're headed for now. If we, through the public review and comment, find that there's a request for templates that aren't already provided in existing documents, then we would consider developing them. But you know, we really wanted to leverage a lot of the great work that has been done, and that is very applicable in California.
Right. And I do think that templates are helpful. I think it's something that we considered like creating our own, and then we decided to reference others. But I know personally I found templates really helpful with outreach and doing like stakeholder mapping or planning agendas and workshops. So that's something if others have examples that they want to submit to us, please do in the survey and in the feedback. The next question is from Pat from LA County Planning. Miles, will you be looking at urban and suburban examples or coastal bay examples?
Yeah, that's responding to both Pat and Gimler C's questions. The answer to that is that Butte and Tulare counties were the two counties that had specifically signed on to be beneficiaries to my Civic Spark project, which is how I'm working with the APG project teams. So those are the two counties I'm working in depth with, and that I will be providing case studies for in this and so I specifically will not be providing those examples. However, there are several different call out boxes in the guide itself that have a much wider range of examples and resources for efforts that are already underway.
Miles and Derek, I mean, it sounds like Pat and Gumir have examples or maybe an interest in APG 2.0, looking at urban, suburban, and coastal bay examples. So do you think that that's something that could be included in the future? I mean, maybe not as a part of APG 2.0 right now, but maybe something that you all collaborate with OPR on?
I honestly don't know how to answer that one, just because, as Miles mentioned, that we were able to work his duties with and obligations with the Civic Spark program and couple them in with this APG, so it kind of gave a tight scope on how far we could go. But yeah, obviously, yes, it would be great to cover as much as we can, and I'm sure that's something that can be looked at in as far as the next iteration of the APG. And as it will be an interactive source, we're hoping that it is user friendly for all once it becomes live on the clearinghouse.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is Tammy. I just really do want to reiterate that the APG is full of examples, and we have made an effort to provide examples from around the state with consideration of urban and suburban and rural communities and coastal or bay and inland. And so they're showing examples, brief examples. We're trying in the APG to show examples at the phase or step level. And then there's taking that broader brush of providing summaries and case studies, which are well represented on the Adaptation Clearinghouse. And then there's the work that Miles is doing with OES and Civic Spark, which is, piloting the APG and seeing, providing the resource and support to the jurisdictions he's mentioned and taking it through the process. So I would say this is working, the effort is at many levels, and the Adaptation Clearinghouse is an excellent resource for finding case studies and examples. And our goal with the APG is to integrate with that, as Derek mentioned, then also to be able to unearth and reveal any examples they may not be as well known and shared as well. So we are definitely asking for folks to share any examples, either at a very small project scale or a large community scale or a regional scale, and we can consider whether they should go in the APG or on the Adaptation Clearinghouse.
Thank you for those good questions. Does anyone else in the audience have other questions that they'd like to ask? I think one of the things that has been touched upon in other webinars and then even the in-person presentations is the appendix. I want to know if maybe, Eli, you talked about it a little bit before, but you could talk about some of the extensive resources we have in the appendix.
Certainly. We have, as we mentioned, we have the example strategies organized by sector, along with the factors for consideration, potential funding resources, examples of co-benefits, and so on. For each of the sectors, we also provide information about what the sector actually is, what it includes. We talk about what are some of the major statewide vulnerabilities that are often seen with that sector, and why these are issues of concern for the state. We have one appendix is dedicated to the adaptation pathways approach, and it provides a good overview of why the pathways may be something that's helpful to consider, what the pathways approach actually is, how communities can integrate this approach into their own adaptation planning efforts. And then we provide one appendix that is looking at more detail about some of the other resources that are out there. So I know there were questions about templates, for example, or other resources beyond the APG that are helpful to point communities to. We do have one appendix that is dedicated to that. And then, as Tammy mentioned, there is an extensive list of sources and citations and places where users of the APG can go for more information. So those are all in the appendix, and we hope that it's information that is helpful and really relevant to everyone who's using this document.
Thank you, Eli. I know that's been a question just about how this APG 2.0 can be intersectoral or touch upon other efforts that the city is doing. I mean, we all know that this work isn't siloed, and so those sector summaries provide ways to overlap with other issues that the city is dealing with. And those sectors, again, they're agriculture, biodiversity and habitat, emergency management, energy, forests, land use and community development, ocean and coast, parks and recreation, public health, transportation, and water. And all of these sectors, the summaries, and the examples of local adaptation strategies are in the appendix if you really want some detailed information or are just having trouble, I think, getting started with your own adaptation strategies and plans. Are there any other questions from the group? If not, I'll turn it over to maybe Tammy and Eli to see if there's other things that came up in prior presentations that you might want to mention.
I think we're good. I think this, our goal here is to make sure that we've provided an overview of the adaptation planning guide, so you're familiar with what's in it as you get started in your review of it, and that you've been able to ask those pressing questions that you have, or questions about what we've presented today. So what we do look forward to is your full review of APG 2.0 public review draft, and in use of the survey that Cal OES has provided to share your comments with us. And we are looking for as specific comments as possible. So if in the cases where, if you feel like something could be elaborated on in more detail or something is missing, we'll welcome, links to resources, summaries, the best information that you can provide us. And we thank you in advance for the time that you'll spend on the review.
Another question has come in, a couple actually. Are resilient asset assessments as well as vulnerability assessments covered?
I'll let Eli answer the VA question.
I have to confess I'm less familiar with the term resilience assessment. We've crafted the vulnerability assessment approach in the APG 2.0 to really be able to get at the full spectrum of potential concerns. So being able to identify how resilient a population or asset is versus how vulnerable it is, I think the way we've set it out is as a bit of a spectrum. So you can certainly assess this particular population or asset is quite resilient. It doesn't have a lot of vulnerability. Or, on the other end of the scale, this population or asset is highly or severely vulnerable. It has very little resilience. So hopefully that is getting at what you're indicating here. But yeah, we've tried to provide some guidance to how to determine if a population or asset is not at all vulnerable, extremely vulnerable, and then sort of everything in between.
Yeah, I'll say, Emily, if there is a kind of framework that or definition of resilience asset assessment that you'd like to share, please provide that in the survey and we can look into it, because I am also not so familiar with that term as much as vulnerability assessments, and maybe that there are some new assessments that we should be aware of in the field. The next question is from Lauren. Are there any areas when creating this update that you would like a little bit more feedback on compared to other areas?
No, I'd say we welcome feedback on all of it for sure. All phases are certainly of interest to folks. Phase 4 implementation, I think, is where we've heard a lot more questions. So maybe if you were picking a phase to spend more time, phase 4 might be it. It is more dependent on best practice and state resources, and as more than peer-reviewed science, I would say, which is, our vulnerability assessment is definitely more established. But the implementation part is certainly more evolving, and we're learning a lot from each other as we go through the process. So I would say definitely please read the whole thing. If you're more familiar with implementation, if you're in a community where you've gone through that, we would certainly welcome your focus on that section as well.
Thanks, Tammy. And Jeffrey says, please remember to send us the link to review this presentation, and also a PDF of the slideshow would be very helpful. Jeffrey, if you could message us with your email, you should have gotten a copy of the PDF presentation, but if you did not, we can send that to you, no problem. And then I'm going to post the survey link again in the chat box. That's the 5-question survey to provide feedback on APG 2.0. Question from Emily, is there a more specific closing date for the survey versus early January so we can make sure not to miss the deadline? Derek, can you speak to that?
Unfortunately, there's not a clear date. It will be a 30-day, 30 calendar day public review period that'll commence as soon as we're able to post it. So unfortunately, at this point, all I could suggest is maybe setting an Outlook reminder or something to that effect. But at this point, we're looking at probably at least through the 10th of January.
This is Julia. Is it possible to send an email to the folks who are on this call as a way to let them know when the document's available and when the final closing date would be?
Yes, I think that would be great, Julia. We could do that, and we could also send it to you to make sure if you wanted to get it out to the APA California chapter listserv.
Well, absolutely. When it's available, we'll send out something to our listserv.
Thank you.
Also, as a note, and as part of the email that was sent out this morning, folks should have also received a PDF of the document for their perusal.
Okay, if there are no other questions, we will end this webinar a little bit early. I think we've had ample time to review the content and then also get some really good questions in our chat box. So I want to appreciate you all taking the time out of your lunch hour to talk with us and review and preview this document. Again, it will be available on the Cal OES website fairly soon. Maybe Miles, you can put it in the chat box if you want again, but we will email the folks who attended this webinar with information on where the document is, a copy of the presentation, and then a survey link to provide feedback. One other question came up in the chat box about the AICP-CM number. Jeffrey, I don't think we have an AICP-CM number for this. Is that correct, Julia?
No, we don't. I'm not sure it qualifies.
Right, because it is a public review, right? Process.
Because the actual content was half an hour or less.
I see. Thank you for that clarification.